The sun was setting over downtown Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Police Officer Wilson had been on patrol for nearly 6 hours, and his mood was as dark as the approaching night. His dashboard clock showed 7:45 p.m. when he spotted a black Mercedes with slightly tinted windows cruising down Peachtree Street. Something about the car caught his attention, or perhaps it was just his assumptions taking over. He followed the vehicle for several blocks, looking for any excuse to pull it over. The Mercedes maintained perfect speed, used turn signals properly, and followed every traffic rule to the letter. Still, Wilson flipped on his patrol lights, determined to find something wrong. Behind the wheel sat Dr. Anderson, a distinguished Army captain and military surgeon. She was exhausted after performing 3 back-to-back surgeries at the VA hospital, her mind already dreaming of the warm shower and quiet evening ahead. The flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror snapped her back to full alertness. Really? Today of all days? She whispered to herself, taking a deep breath. Years of military training and hospital emergencies had taught her to stay calm under pressure. She knew exactly what to do. Right turn signal on, slowly pull over to a well-lit spot, interior lights on, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The Mercedes came to a perfect stop under a bright street lamp near a busy coffee shop. Dr. Anderson could see people sitting by the window, sipping their evening lattes, completely unaware of what was about to unfold outside. She reached slowly for her registration in the glove compartment, movements deliberate and measured. Officer Wilson watched from his patrol car, his hand already resting on his weapon. The tint on the Mercedes windows wasn't even dark enough to be illegal, but he'd already decided this stop wasn't going to be routine. He radioed in the license plate, jaw tightening when dispatch reported the vehicle was registered to a respected doctor with a clean record. As he approached the driver's side window, his footsteps were heavy with purpose. The interior light showed a woman in blue medical scrubs, her hair neatly pulled back, hospital ID still clipped to her pocket. But Wilson chose not to notice these details. Instead, his flashlight beam aggressively swept across her face, the bright light unnecessary in the already well-lit area. License and registration, he barked, not bothering with the usual polite greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was sharp enough to draw attention from the coffee shop patrons, several of whom now watched the scene with growing concern. Dr. Anderson kept her voice steady and professional. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Her years of handling high-pressure situations in both the military and emergency room had taught her to maintain composure, even when faced with unwarranted hostility. "I said license and registration," Wilson repeated, louder this time, deliberately ignoring her question. His free hand remained uncomfortably close to his weapon, despite the obvious lack of threat. With slow, deliberate movements, Dr. Anderson handed over her documents. The hospital parking pass was visible on her dashboard, her Caduceus medical symbol keychain dangled from the ignition, and a military service sticker was clearly displayed on her back window. But Officer Wilson was seeing what he wanted to see, or rather, not seeing what he didn't want to acknowledge. Little did he know, this routine traffic stop was about to become a pivotal moment in both their lives. The next few minutes would not only challenge his deeply held prejudices, but would also spark a change that would ripple through the entire police department. As the coffee shop patrons continued to watch and passing cars slowed down to observe, the tension in the air grew thicker. The evening was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and the possibility of transformation. Dr. Anderson sat perfectly still, her hands never leaving the steering wheel as Officer Wilson scrutinized her license and registration under his flashlight beam. The coffee shop across the street had grown quiet, its customers now fully invested in the scene unfolding before them. A young barista had pulled out her phone, discreetly recording the interaction, something that would later prove crucial. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Wilson commanded, his voice carrying an edge that made several onlookers exchange worried glances. The order came without explanation, without probable cause, without any legitimate reason beyond the power he thought he held. "Officer, I've had a long day performing surgeries at the VA hospital," Dr. Anderson replied calmly, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "I've provided my documents, which are all in order. Could you please tell me why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle? The mention of the VA hospital should have given Wilson pause. The medical scrubs, the hospital ID, the parking pass, all pieces of a puzzle he was choosing to ignore. Instead, his face hardened and his grip tightened on her license. I'm not going to ask again, he said, voice rising. Exit the vehicle now. His free hand moved to his belt, a gesture that sent ripples of tension through the growing crowd of onlookers. Dr. Anderson's military training kicked in. Years of handling high-stress situations had taught her to remain composed while assessing all options. She thought of her patients at the hospital, the veterans who trusted her with their lives. She thought of her position, her responsibility to handle this situation in a way that might prevent it from happening to someone else. Officer Wilson, she said, reading his nameplate, her voice calm but firm, I want to comply with your requests, but I also have the right to know why I'm being detained. I've done nothing wrong, and your current actions are making me concerned for my safety. Her professional tone seemed to aggravate him further. Wilson stepped back, reaching for his radio. Dispatch, I need backup at my location. I have an uncooperative subject refusing to exit the vehicle. The words uncooperative subject hung in the air, a stark contrast to the reality visible to everyone watching. More phones had emerged from the coffee shop, recording the escalating situation. A couple had stepped outside, their presence serving as silent witnesses. Inside her car, Dr. Anderson maintained her composure, though her heart raced. She'd seen this scenario play out before, had treated its victims in her emergency room. But she also knew that her position and experience gave her a unique opportunity to challenge this abuse of power. The sound of distant sirens grew closer. Officer Wilson paced beside her car, his agitation visible in every movement. He created a situation he couldn't easily back down from, but Dr. Anderson's calm defiance was making it impossible for him to justify his actions. Through her side mirror, Dr. Anderson could see two more patrol cars approaching, their lights painting the street in flashing red and blue. The evening air had grown thick with tension, and the coffee shop crowd had spilled onto the sidewalk, their phones capturing every moment. What happened next would change not just their lives, but the entire department's approach to traffic stops. As backup arrived, none of them could have predicted how this encounter would transform from a moment of prejudice into a catalyst for change. The familiar sound of car doors slamming echoed through the street as the backup officers approached. Dr. Anderson took a deep breath, knowing the next few minutes would require all her experience, all her training, and all her dignity. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore, she was standing up for every person who'd ever faced similar treatment but lacked the position or power to fight back. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved to examine their assumptions, their biases, and their understanding of what it truly means to protect and serve. As the backup officers drew closer, the weight of the moment settled over the scene like a heavy blanket, and everyone present could sense that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Two backup patrol cars pulled up to the scene, their red and blue lights bouncing off the windows of nearby buildings. Dr. Anderson watched in her rearview mirror as three more officers approached, their expressions changing from routine concern to confusion as they took in the scene. A woman in medical scrubs, sitting calmly with her hands on the steering wheel, surrounded by a growing crowd of concerned onlookers. Officer Wilson immediately walked over to his colleagues, speaking in hushed but agitated tones. His body language told its own story: defensive posture, quick gestures, the occasional pointed finger toward the black Mercedes. The other officers exchanged glances, clearly sensing something wasn't adding up. The youngest of the backup officers, Officer Chen, approached Dr. Anderson's window. His demeanor was notably different from Wilson's, professional but not aggressive. "Good evening, ma'am. Could you help us understand what's happening here?" Before Dr. Anderson could respond, Wilson cut in. "She's refusing to comply with a lawful order to exit the vehicle." His voice was loud enough for the coffee shop crowd to hear, perhaps hoping to justify his actions to the growing audience. Dr. Anderson seized this moment to speak, her voice clear and steady. "Officers, I'm a chief surgeon at the VA hospital. I've been stopped without cause, denied an explanation for being pulled over, and ordered out of my car without reason. I've provided all requested documentation, which Officer Wilson is still holding." The backup officers turned to Wilson, who was still clutching Dr. Anderson's license and registration. Officer Chen's eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed the hospital ID clipped to her scrubs, the medical parking pass on the dashboard, and the military service sticker on her back window, all details that painted a very different picture from Wilson's claims. "I have the right to know why I'm being detained," Dr. Anderson continued, maintaining her composure. "And I'm concerned about Officer Wilson's increasingly aggressive behavior, which is why I've chosen to wait for backup before stepping out of my vehicle." One of the coffee shop patrons stepped forward, phone in hand. "We've been watching the whole thing," she called out. "She's done nothing wrong. We have it all on video." The atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Officer Chen turned to his senior colleague, Officer Taylor, who had been observing the scene with growing concern. Taylor nodded slightly and stepped forward, taking charge of the situation. "Officer Wilson," Taylor said firmly, "I'll need to see those documents." As Wilson reluctantly handed over Dr. Anderson's license and registration, Taylor's eyebrows rose slightly. He walked back to Dr. Anderson's window, his stance noticeably more respectful. "Dr. Anderson," he began, but she gently interrupted him. "Before we continue," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to operating rooms and combat zones, "I'd like to make something clear. This stop was initiated without cause, escalated without reason, and has now involved multiple officers and public witnesses. I want to speak with a supervisor." The crowd from the coffee shop murmured in approval. More phones were recording now, capturing every word, every gesture. Officer Taylor reached for his radio, but before he could call it in, a senior officer's vehicle pulled up to the scene. The timing couldn't have been better. Lieutenant Rivera stepped out of his car, taking in the scene with experienced eyes, the gathered crowd with their phones, the multiple patrol cars, the clearly professional woman in medical scrubs, and Officer Wilson's increasingly uncomfortable stance. Dr. Anderson watched through her window as Lieutenant Rivera approached, knowing the next few moments would be crucial. She wasn't just thinking about herself anymore. She was thinking about every other person who'd faced similar treatment but didn't have her advantages, her rank, her position, her ability to demand accountability. The lieutenant's arrival marked a turning point in what had started as a routine traffic stop and evolved into something much more significant. As he walked towards her car, Dr. Anderson prepared herself for what would come next, not just the resolution of this incident, but the bigger conversation it would spark about power, prejudice, and the possibility of real change in law enforcement. Lieutenant Rivera approached Dr. Anderson's car with measured steps, the crowd falling silent as he drew near. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes took in every detail of the scene: the gathered witnesses, the multiple police vehicles, the tense stance of Officer Wilson, and the remarkably composed woman in medical scrubs sitting in the Mercedes. "Good evening," he said, bending slightly to speak through the driver's window. "I'm Lieutenant Rivera. Could you help me understand what's happening here?" Dr. Anderson looked directly at him, her voice clear and steady. "Lieutenant, I'm Dr. Anderson, Chief of Surgery at the VA Medical Center." She paused, letting that sink in. "I've just finished a 12-hour shift performing surgery on veterans, and I was headed home when Officer Wilson pulled me over without cause." The lieutenant's eyes flickered to her hospital ID, still clipped to her scrubs. Recognition dawned on his face. He'd seen her photo in the local paper just last week, accepting an award for her groundbreaking work with wounded veterans. "Doctor," he said, his tone shifting to one of deep respect, "would you mind stepping out of the car now? You have my word that you're safe." For the first time since the stop began, Dr. Anderson's hands left the steering wheel. She opened her door slowly, emerging from the vehicle with the same grace she carried in her operating room. At her full height, wearing surgical scrubs, and with her military bearing evident, she cut an impressive figure. "Lieutenant," she continued, reaching into her pocket with deliberate movements, "I'd like you to see this as well." She produced her military ID, displaying her rank as captain. "I've served 3 tours as a combat surgeon before taking my position at the VA. I know protocol, I know my rights, and I know when those rights are being violated." The crowd from the coffee shop had inched closer, their phones still recording. Officer Wilson's face had drained of color as the reality of his actions began to sink in. Officer Chen, the young backup officer, looked at his colleague with a mixture of disappointment and dismay. Dr. Anderson, Lieutenant Rivera spoke carefully. I want to personally apologize for any distress this has caused you. Could you walk me through exactly what happened from the beginning? She nodded, her voice remaining professional but firm. I was followed for several blocks without cause. When I was pulled over, Officer Wilson approached my vehicle with his hand on his weapon, despite no indication of threat. He refused to state the reason for the stop, became increasingly aggressive, and attempted to escalate the situation despite my full compliance. The lieutenant turned to the gathered crowd. Did anyone witness this from the beginning? Several hands went up. The young barista stepped forward, her phone still recording. We all saw it, sir. We have videos. She did nothing wrong. Officer Wilson was, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He was not professional. Lieutenant Rivera nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about systemic issues, about accountability, about the trust between law enforcement and the community they served. Dr. Anderson stood straight, her military training evident in her bearing. Lieutenant, I want to be clear about something. I'm not interested in personal retribution. What I want is systematic change. This kind of incident happens too often to people who don't have the advantages of my position and rank to protect them. The crowd murmured in agreement. Officer Wilson had backed away slightly, his earlier aggression replaced by the dawning realization of the magnitude of his actions. Officer Chen had moved closer to Dr. Anderson, subtly positioning himself as her protective detail rather than her detainer. What happened here tonight? Dr. Anderson continued, her voice carrying to the entire gathered crowd, needs to be a catalyst for change. Not just for me, not just for this department, but for every person who's ever been profiled, every citizen who's felt afraid during what should be a routine interaction with law enforcement. Lieutenant Rivera listened intently, understanding that this moment could either be a crisis for the department or an opportunity for real transformation. The night air was thick with tension, but also with possibility. As he prepared to respond, everyone present could sense that they were witnessing something significant, a moment when justice, accountability, and the potential for change converged on a city street corner, all because one person had the courage and position to stand her ground. Lieutenant Rivera stood quietly for a moment, weighing the gravity of the situation. The street had grown even more crowded, with passing cars slowing down to observe the scene. The coffee shop patrons remained vigilant, their phones still recording, bearing witness to what had become much more than a simple traffic stop. Dr. Anderson, the lieutenant finally spoke, I'd like to review the body camera footage right now, if you're willing to wait. His tone carried both authority and genuine concern. This wasn't just about following procedure anymore, this was about doing what was right. Dr. Anderson nodded, her professional demeanor unchanged. I think that would be appropriate, Lieutenant. I also believe the community members here have additional video evidence they might be willing to share. She gestured toward the coffee shop crowd, who nodded in agreement. Officer Wilson stood off to the side, his earlier aggression replaced by visible discomfort. The young officer, Chen, had already connected his body camera to a department tablet, ready to review the footage. The technology that was meant to protect officers had become a tool for accountability. As the video began to play, the gathering watched Officer Wilson's approach to the Mercedes, his immediate aggressive stance, his hand positioned on his weapon without cause. The audio captured his harsh tone, the lack of explanation for the stop, the escalating hostility despite Dr. Anderson's calm compliance. Lieutenant Rivera's expression grew more concerned with each passing moment. The contrast between Officer Wilson's behavior and Dr. Anderson's composed responses was stark. The footage showed everything: the unnecessary aggression, the baseless suspicion, the clear profiling that had led to this stop. "Stop the video," he said quietly. He turned to Dr. Anderson, his face showing genuine regret. "Doctor, I want to extend my deepest apologies on behalf of the department. This is not how we train our officers to conduct themselves. This is not what we stand for." But Dr. Anderson wasn't finished. She reached into her car and pulled out a folder. "Lieutenant, I've been keeping records. This isn't an isolated incident in this area. I've collected statements from other medical professionals, veterans, and community members who've experienced similar treatment. Today's incident is just one example of a larger pattern." The crowd murmured in agreement. Several people stepped forward, eager to share their own stories. The young barista spoke up again. "We see it happen all the time from our window. We just never had someone with Dr. Anderson's position to stand up before." Lieutenant Rivera took the folder, understanding its significance. This wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer's misconduct. This was an opportunity for real change, handed to him by someone who could have easily used their position to simply file a complaint and walk away. "Dr. Anderson," he said, his voice carrying to the entire gathering, "I'd like to propose something. Would you be willing to work with our department? We need people like you, professionals who understand both sides, who can help us build better relationships with the community." The doctor's expression remained serious, but a glimmer of hope appeared in her eyes. "Lieutenant, I've spent my career serving others, first in combat zones, now in the operating room. If my experience today can help create positive change, I'm willing to be part of that process." Officer Chen stepped forward, his young face earnest. "Dr. Anderson, I'd like to learn from you. Many of us would. We need to do better, and we need help understanding how." The night had grown cooler, but the tension in the air had transformed into something different, a sense of possibility, of potential change. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing they were witnessing something important, a moment when confrontation could lead to transformation. Officer Wilson, still standing apart from the group, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier arrogance. I need to rethink some things." It wasn't a full acknowledgement or apology, but it was a start. A crack in the wall of prejudice that had led to this incident. Dr. Anderson looked around at the gathered faces, the concerned citizens, the watching officers, the hopeful lieutenant. She'd walked into this evening expecting to face yet another unjust situation. Instead, she'd found an opportunity to create real change, to turn a moment of injustice into a catalyst for transformation. The next morning, the police station buzzed with activity. News of the previous night's incident had spread quickly, partly due to the viral videos shared by the coffee shop witnesses. The chief of police sat in his office, reviewing the body camera footage for the third time, his face growing more concerned with each viewing. Dr. Anderson arrived at the station dressed in her military uniform, her captain's bars gleaming on her shoulders. The front desk officer immediately recognized her, not just from the previous night's incident, but from her numerous appearances at veteran events throughout the city. She was escorted directly to the chief's office, where Lieutenant Rivera was already waiting. "Dr. Anderson," the chief began, standing to greet her, "thank you for coming. We've spent the morning reviewing everything. The body camera footage, civilian videos, and the file you provided showing other incidents in our jurisdiction." He gestured to her folder, now filled with sticky notes and highlighter marks. "Chief," she replied, her voice firm but constructive, "I'm here because I believe in the possibility of change. What happened last night wasn't just about me, it was about every person who's experienced similar treatment but lacked the position or voice to challenge it." The chief nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "We're initiating a full internal affairs investigation," he said, "not just into last night's incident, but into the pattern of stops you've documented. Officer Wilson has been placed on administrative duty pending the investigation." But Dr. Anderson leaned forward, her expression determined. "That's a start, Chief, but it's not enough. Punishment without education doesn't create lasting change. I have a proposal." She pulled out a detailed plan she'd worked on through the early morning hours. "I'm offering to help develop a new training program, one that combines my military leadership experience with my medical background in stress response and decision-making. We need to address the root causes of these incidents, not just respond to them after they happen." Lieutenant Rivera picked up the proposal, scanning it with growing interest. The program outlined practical scenarios, psychological insights, and community engagement strategies. It wasn't just about pointing out what officers did wrong, it was about giving them tools to do better. "This could work," the lieutenant said thoughtfully. "But we'd need buy-in from the officers themselves. Many of them feel defensive when these issues are raised." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Chen entered, followed by several other officers from the previous night's shift. "Sorry to interrupt, Chief," he said, "but word got around that Dr. Anderson was here. We want to be part of this. We want to help make changes." The chief looked surprised but pleased. Even more surprising was the figure that appeared behind them. Officer Wilson, his usual confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I'd like to be involved too," he said quietly. "Last night, it made me realize some things about myself I need to work on." Dr. Anderson studied him for a moment, seeing past the surface to the possibility of real transformation. "That's exactly the kind of honesty we need," she said. "Change starts with recognition and willingness to learn." The meeting expanded as more officers joined, pulling in extra chairs, sharing experiences, and offering suggestions. The energy in the room shifted from tension to possibility. These weren't just empty promises or mandatory sensitivity training. This was real people acknowledging real problems and committing to real solutions. "We could start with ride-alongs," one officer suggested. "Get community leaders to see what we deal with and let us learn from them too." "And regular community meetings," another added. "Not just when there's a problem, but to build relationships before issues arise." Dr. Anderson watched as the ideas flowed, her military training recognizing the importance of this moment. True change often started small, not with grand announcements or sweeping reforms, but with individual people choosing to do better, to learn more, to see differently. The chief's secretary appeared at the door, surprised by the impromptu gathering. "Sir, the media is outside. They're asking for a statement about last night's incident." The room fell quiet. Dr. Anderson stood, straightening her uniform. "I'll speak with them," she said. "But not about blame or punishment. We'll tell them about what we're building here, about positive change and community healing. That's the story that needs to be told." 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The coffee shop where it all began had become a regular meeting spot for community police dialogues. On this particular evening, the usual customers watched as Dr. Anderson walked in, still wearing her surgical scrubs, followed by a familiar face, Officer Wilson. They weren't alone. The small shop was filled with police officers and community members gathered for their weekly discussion group. The walls now displayed photos of joint community events, sports games between police and local youth, and newspaper clippings about the changes in the department. "I never thought I'd be sitting here like this," Officer Wilson admitted to the group, his voice carrying genuine reflection. 6 months ago, I was part of the problem. I didn't want to see my own biases. Now I'm teaching other officers about what I've learned." Dr. Anderson watched him with quiet satisfaction. The transformation in Wilson hadn't been easy or quick. It had taken weeks of honest conversations, uncomfortable self-reflection, and a genuine desire to change. But the results were undeniable. "The numbers tell the story," Lieutenant Rivera announced, sharing the latest department statistics. "Complaints are down 60%, community trust ratings have doubled, and most importantly, our officers report feeling more connected to the people they serve." The young barista who had recorded the original incident smiled as she served coffee to the group. "It's different now," she said. "When we see police cars in the neighborhood, we don't feel tension anymore. We see familiar faces, people we know." Officer Chen, now a key figure in the training program, pulled out his tablet to share some recent body camera footage. But these weren't videos of confrontations. They showed positive interactions, officers helping community members, moments of understanding and respect. "We're using our cameras differently now," he explained, "not just to document problems, but to capture good policing in action. These videos become teaching tools for new officers." Dr. Anderson's training program had evolved beyond her initial proposal. It now included stress management techniques from her medical background, leadership principles from her military experience, and real-world scenarios that challenged officers to think differently about their interactions. The key was making it practical, she explained to a visiting police chief from another city. "We're not just talking about change, we're showing officers specific ways to handle situations better. And we're learning from them too." The program had caught the attention of departments across the state. What started as a response to one incident had grown into a model for police reform. Officers from other cities regularly visited to observe and learn. Even the coffee shop had become part of the story. The owner had created a community corner where people could leave notes about positive interactions with police officers. The wall was covered with colorful sticky notes sharing stories of help, kindness, and understanding. Officer Wilson stood up, addressing the group. "You know what the biggest change is?" he asked. "It's not just about how we police anymore. It's about how we see each other. I used to approach every situation looking for problems. Now I look for connections. A young officer raised her hand. But what about the hard days, when things get tense and old habits try to come back? Dr. Anderson nodded, appreciating the honest question. That's why we keep meeting like this. Change isn't a one-time thing, it's a daily choice. Every traffic stop, every interaction is a chance to do things differently. The evening sun cast long shadows through the coffee shop windows as the discussion continued. Outside, patrol cars drove past with officers who now knew the names of the people on their beat. Inside, former adversaries had become partners in progress. Sometimes, Dr. Anderson reflected, watching the engaged faces around her, the worst moments can lead to the best changes. What matters is what we choose to do after those moments. As the meeting wound down, plans were made for the next community event. Officer Wilson lingered behind, helping to stack chairs. You know, he said quietly to Dr. Anderson, that night could have gone very differently. Thank you for seeing the possibility for change, even when I couldn't see it myself. Dr. Anderson smiled, remembering the tension of that night 6 months ago. That's what progress looks like, she said. Not perfection, but the willingness to keep moving forward, one conversation, one interaction, one person at a time. The coffee shop lights dimmed as the last participants left, but the energy of positive change remained. What had started as a confrontation had grown into a movement, proving that even the darkest moments could become catalysts for lasting transformation.